So we're going to focus on what it means to be a catalyst, because that's what I'm about and doing. But first of all, I know you guys have sort of back-to-back sessions and we're all leading crazy, crazy lives. So I'd just love to take a minute to arrive in whatever way feels comfortable for you. Maybe lengthening your spine and settling into a posture that's alert but relaxed. Maybe closing your eyes if that feels comfortable, or having a soft downward gaze. Just taking a few moments to breathe. Maybe a few big breaths to start off with. In through the nose and out through the mouth. Then just settling into your normal breath. Just noticing what it feels like to be present right now. Maybe feeling your feet grounding you on the floor, or your sits bones on the chair, or your hands wherever they fall. Maybe just letting your shoulders melt away from your ears a little. And then with the next 3 breaths, maybe just setting an intention for the call, how you'd like to show up, maybe what you'd like to give to the group, or what you'd like to receive. And then when you're ready, opening your eyes and coming back to the group. My name is Shannon. I am the co-founder and co-CEO of Catalyst Constellations. Formerly, recently, the executive vice president of emerging business at Ericsson, a 140-year-old now telecommunications company based out of Sweden. I spent 20 years in the tech worlds at big companies like Vodafone, which you guys overseas will know very well. Not everyone in the US knows. Cisco, Microsoft, T-Mobile. I've also started my own companies before, worked at other startups, launched my own ventures, and I've been on several boards. And I'm thrilled to be here today. I identify as a catalyst, and we'll talk about what that means. But we just recently released a book called Move Fast, Break Shit, Burn Out, The Catalyst Guide to Working Well. And we wrote this because we think that catalysts are more important than ever before, and because a burnt out catalyst creates no change at all. And so we'll talk about why that's so important for this community. Let's start by defining it. What does a catalyst mean? Well, the dictionary definition says that it's a person or thing that causes a change or an action, which also makes sense. But our definition is they're change makers with an unstoppable drive to action, brimming with ideas to make the world better. We often get called other things: troublemaker, disruptor, change maker, problem solver. And while sometimes we wear these monikers with a badge of honor, they aren't always intended that way. So we'll talk a little bit more about what it can feel like to be a catalyst. When we look at the world of change agents broadly, we see that people can often choose to lean into creating change or not. But when we did the research, we found there was this subset of people who had these traits that were innate. And we'll talk about what those traits are. But so essentially, catalysts are this small subgroup of change agents that show up the same way. And we found 6 attributes across the Catalyst community. The first one is we piece together information quickly. And we talk about sort of being able to do the sense making, the dot connecting out in the world. We will take information from sci-fi books, from conversations, from McKinsey reports. We're constantly sort of sensing about what's emerging in our field of vision right now. And from that, we start to see lots of possibilities of things that could be improved, whether you're standing in line at a cafe and you think about how you could optimize that, or something at home or in your work world. But we don't just stop there. From there, we coalesce visions, specific things that need to sort of be created in the world, like bringing lots of plants to the Sahara as an example of a vision. Importantly, and distinctly for Catalysts, we have this drive for action that transforms. So this sets us apart from other visionaries who might just sort of look into the future and do some future casting. We actually take the next steps to make this vision a reality. And we get sort of physically connected to making sure that that thing gets born in the world. We show up with an experimentation mindset. So we are often drawn to things like design thinking or the scientific method. And the iteration through that process feels very natural and comfortable for us. And because of that, we're often described as being intuitive or being comfortable with risk and ambiguity. Although importantly for us, it doesn't always feel risky because we have synthesized so much of the data that we feel very clear that this thing needs to happen in the world. So if you're wondering if you're a catalyst, we have some questions for you. Do you feel driven to do things to make the world better around you? Do you frequently piece together information quickly and see a path to action? Do you sometimes overwhelm people around you with all of the ideas that you have? Or do you sometimes even overwhelm yourself with all of the ideas that you have? Do you often challenge the status quo or get referred to as disruptive? When tackling a challenge, do you try different approaches to try and figure out what is the most effective way to go? Or does the term catalyst just feel right? If you answered yes to every question, we have no doubt that you are a catalyst, although you don't need to sort of answer yes to every question right now. And if the term catalyst feels right, then lean into it. Why are catalysts so important today? There's a term called Vuca. Are people familiar with this term, Vuca? And just show of hands, anyone? No? Yeah. So Vuca came out of the US military in the 1980s as they were trying to understand sort of the post-Cold War context. And as they looked around, they said there's these 4 traits. The current reality is more volatile, more uncertain, more complex, and more ambiguous than it has ever been. But as you know, in the 1980s, the digital revolution really hadn't started, and the digital revolution has only really accelerated and exacerbated our new Vuca reality. Some years later, the founder of the Institute for the Future, Bob Johansen, came up with what he calls Vuca Prime, which is essentially trying to understand how individuals and organizations need to be able to respond to Vuca. So they need to be able to have that vision. They need to bring depth of understanding. They need to get clarity quickly, and they need to be agile. I've been talking about Vuca for a long time, and some leaders have understood, but I think a lot of companies and a lot of leaders have not really sort of intuited or ingested the fact that we are definitely living in a Vuca reality until this year. And so we're increasingly talking about this as the time of the catalyst, because I think this year has shown just exactly how volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous our new reality is. And as you can imagine, based on the 6 characteristics that I just walked through and the questions, it's no doubt to us that catalysts are essentially born Vuca ready, because we have the vision, the understanding, the clarity, and the agility. We move fast. And importantly, we take those steps to action to make those new future possibilities real. We did some research about how industry experts were talking about, the skills that they were going to need in their organizations to become Vuca ready or Vuca adaptive. And you can see some of these: sense making, connecting the dots. A lot of you talked about loving to learn, so sort of the learning agility, the adaptability, the focus on innovation, the agility and speed. Someone said being comfortable with the uncomfortable. Yes, 100%. That is definitely required nowadays. The ability to have the emotional intelligence, to have the situational awareness, and also some metacognition, which is combined sort of with the situational awareness, which is like, you know, how am I navigating this? How am I self-moderating, and how are other people showing up? When we did the research then with Catalyst and their managers to identify what the Catalyst superpowers are, you see it's essentially a one-to-one correlation. Dot connecting is one of the superpowers that we talk about. The people historically haven't been able to sort of place or assign value against, but we know that we need that now more than ever. Catalysts are intuitive, as we mentioned, and we show up with a high EQ. We bring empathy throughout our process, which is why things like design thinking feel so right to us. We start with empathy. We can be strong communicators. We definitely sort of lean into self-awareness and constant self-improvement, not just the improvement in the organization. We have that quest for understanding and learning at speed, and we can pivot agilely because we're not attached to an outcome. We're attached to sort of like what the best outcome possibly could be. Well, those are all our superpowers. Catalysts do have some blind spots and challenges. Oops. First of all, we are, you know, usually on the front foot of finding new things, which can cause a lot of self-doubt because we are often doing things that no one has ever done before. So we can feel like an imposter, even though we're really sure at the same time that the vision that we're moving towards is the right one. We can have trouble prioritizing because so many things need to be done, and that can be exacerbated by our all-consuming passion to make the world a better place. We can be overwhelmed by our own ideas, and we can sort of struggle in terms of bringing people along because we can lack clarity. We want to move faster than others, which then, you know, is an indication of our own impatience, which causes resistance and, you know, makes other people think that we're perceived as, you know, that we're arrogant because we're so sure that we're right. We can struggle to get the ideas across, and that can precipitate us not feeling valued because people don't understand the value that we're bringing because we haven't been able to clearly articulate it. The irony of all ironies is as soon as we, you know, sort of get the flywheel going and we can see that the progress is likely to continue, we can lose interest in our own ideas and we start to see the next big thing that we want to manifest in the world. And from all of that, we can sort of be feared, disliked, and misunderstood. The challenges sort of manifest into three different consequences. As I mentioned, with all of those ideas swirling and all of our passion, we can sometimes have a lack of clarity or, you know, struggle being able to articulate exactly where we're headed and bring people along. And as you can probably intuit from everything we just shared, we can rub people the wrong way and kind of leave our empathy at the door as we're engaging our internal stakeholders, even though we're really good at doing it during the sensing part, which can cause isolation. And finally, because we are, you know, so driven to create the change in the world, and because we often don't get the support that we need, burnout is really high in terms of the overall population of catalysts. When we did the data, when we did the research, we saw a pretty typical energetic journey for catalysts as they go from first starting to understand or like lean into a new concept all the way through to the sort of end of the journey. As we're starting to do that sense making and connecting the dots, it's an almost euphoric feel. Like you can start to feel the buzz of what does need to happen. How am I going to address climate change? Where are the areas that are sort of ripe for disruption? You start to sense like who's doing what in what area, and you start to see these ideas starting to emerge in that new vision. We get a ton of energy during this phase. It's super fun. We're having more conversations. We're getting more people on board. We're sort of, you know, activating networks to join the movement with us. And during this phase, because we're getting so much net positive energy and we're so excited about making this new vision a reality, we can actually start to leave behind some of the normal energy sustaining activities that we might otherwise keep in our lives, like a daily yoga practice or going for a run or getting together with friends. As the vision starts to crystallize and as we transition into sort of getting the actual idea implemented, the stakeholders lined up, whether internally or externally, you see that our energy starts to wobble a little bit there at the top. We go from, yeah, we're going to do it, to, ooh, we're starting to have to bring other people along. They don't understand. And finally, we get to this thing that we call orchestration, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's sort of like the orchestra getting everyone who needs to be involved singing from the same sheet or playing their music from the same sheet, and moving in the same direction. The skills required in orchestration, and this is a generality, but the skills required in orchestration is where we start to get into like the minutia of the details of how you're going to implement this, the processes. In the US, we say dotting the I's and crossing the T's. It's that attention to detail, and constant repetition of the vision to make sure that people sort of know where their role is as you're creating that vision. You can see the energy curve start to sort of flatten out there. We're not getting as much energy anymore, but we're not losing a ton of energy either, because we can see that the idea is making progress. Those words that we basically weren't allowed to say 9 months ago are coming back to us because we've been successful and sort of started evangelizing across the organization. But inevitably, we will hit resistance because change is hard, and not most people don't have a great and easy relationship with change. This is the role of being a change maker. The resistance can come in the form of, if you've brought your divergent thinking or your new idea and you're putting it out in front of the group, it can look like people starting to pull apart or attack the idea, the naysayers in the room. The people are going to find, oh, we've tried that 10 times, that's never going to work again, sort of feedback. But sometimes, either intentionally or unintentionally, the actual attacks and critiques can end up coming directly at us. That's a crazy idea. How could you have had that idea? This is where the troublemaker and disruptor, problem creator sort of monikers can come from. And if that's really harsh, and if we're not well supported, that can result in trauma for catalysts. And so you see catalysts, spending a few years in different roles because the trauma, can be real. But even without the trauma, at some point or another, most catalysts experience burnout. And that can be because we haven't gotten the support, we don't know how to articulate our own value, or because we're doing a huge energetic load to keep the organization sort of focused and moving in sync with us. The good news is that we can modify that energy journey. And we do that by understanding sort of like how a catalyst innately shows up in the world. This is what we call the catalyst formula. And this is sort of how we move through the world. We create that vision that we were talking about. And as we mentioned earlier, we move very quickly into action. And action can look like writing your first blog post. It can look like interviewing 10 more stakeholders. It can look like a very rough prototype, but we're likely to move into some kind of action pretty quickly. And we do that because we're looking for more data. And this is why things like I mentioned, design thinking, lean startup, scientific method, you can see there's a strong corollary between those methodologies. And then we'll pause, and then we'll be comfortable with iterations. We'll say, okay, what did we learn? How do we need to modify what we're doing? Let's reinform the vision and go through this process. And so we can go through this process again and again and again. And we can do this very quickly. Now, this is sort of our innate way of being, and we don't often bring, until we sort of come in contact with the concept, we don't often bring a lot of sort of self-awareness or intentionality to this process. And when we don't do that, we can move too fast through the visioning. So we have a vision, we need to get maybe our core stakeholders or our team or our investors on board with the vision. And that can take a lot of repetition. It can take sort of, many rounds of getting to the clarity so that people understand. But we can get bored with that process and start to move into action too fast, which means either we don't have the clarity we need for the vision, or we've just left people behind. And they may all be shaking their heads saying, yeah, I totally believe in the vision, but the people that you're working with may not know what they're going to do differently tomorrow if we move too fast through that movement into action. The action part, if we're not intentional, is where we can break shit. So it's okay to break some stuff, some processes, some norms, etc., as you're trying to create change. That is sort of how change gets created. But it's making sure that you're doing that in a super laser focused and intentional way, so that when you're breaking it, you have the guardrails on, so it's not going to sort of collapse the whole system, and you know what data you're trying to get out of that state, that phase, or those next steps of action. And importantly, taking that moment to reflect about what you learned. Did you take the right action step? And finally, when we encounter resistance, our iteration skills can actually pivot from iterating on the idea itself to iterating, overcoming the resistance. And this is a sort of trap that we can get stuck in, instead of taking 2 steps back and saying, wait, does everyone even understand the vision before I'm trying to troubleshoot sort of where we are in the process and development? And this is where we can spend so much energy that we're not actually now moving forward to creating our vision and making it more concrete. And this can really be an accelerant to burnout. But we know that we can modify that and sort of reduce the amplitude of the burnout and minimize the frequency of the burnout if we basically put our catalyst formula in a container of rejuvenation. The rejuvenation helps us to slow down. It helps us to be more intentional at every step of the process. So as you're going through the visioning process, bringing in the empathy and compassion that you can bring when you're really present and more mindful, and making sure that first you're understanding the needs of the customer or the ecosystem or whatever, and that's where your rejuvenation and design thinking and empathy skills can come in. But then using that empathy and slowness to make sure that the stakeholders are really on board and have internalized how they're going to help make that vision a reality. In the action phase, the rejuvenation and the mindfulness and the empathy and compassion can help you understand how people respond to change, and to make sure that you're taking the right steps to break things, that you're breaking the right things, that you're going to be able to collect the right data to inform the vision. And finally, the rejuvenation and iteration can just help you slow down enough in the iteration process so that you're not losing others, you know, on the process, and that you're taking time for yourself to make sure that your energy tank is full. It's really hard for catalysts because we like to move fast, and they'll say, well, if I slow down, like the change really needs to happen, et cetera, et cetera. But actually the change happens faster when we are more mindful throughout the process, because we've sort of greased the wheels, we've decreased the resistance, and we've increased the likelihood of success. And as I said earlier, a lot of times catalysts won't take the time to rejuvenate for themselves, but when they understand the concept, a burnt out catalyst creates no change at all, they will start to make the time for their own personal rejuvenation in service of the mission or the vision that they're trying to create. So let me just stop there and see if there's any questions. Do we have any catalysts on the call? Nikki,
yes, we do.
Questions, I think.
What was that?
5 out of the 7 questions, so I'm not sure whether that qualifies, but
Yeah, I think it was
front.
probably, which ones didn't resonate with you?
Oh gosh, I can't remember what they were. It was one of the bottom. It was one of the bottom ones.
Sure, let me bring it
I think
back.
the last second to the last.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I tried different approaches when figuring out, you know, which is the most effective as I go. And the other was, yeah, I mean, I'm working on it, but the top one as well. I'd like to do more in that. I'd like to sort of naturally expand that a little bit. The drive to do things to make the world around me better. So
yeah,
I mean,
and
I've got myself half on that.
I want to contextualize that one. This is one that people get hung up on, which is people, and oftentimes it's just sort of like, you know, your role or your context in life. Making the world better around me doesn't have to be it doesn't have to be an exponential thing, you know, an exponential thing. It doesn't have to be tied to the SDGs. And so we find people who are like, well, I'm constantly optimizing processes in my team, or I'm constantly trying to find better ways to do things and be more efficient. Like that is making the world around you better. It doesn't have to be like a wicked goal of tackling climate change to do that. And so we find people who are like playing more in their swim lanes, creating change. That one feels like they aren't allowed to own it, but we mean it like everywhere. And often catalysts will be doing things like that at home too, or in other parts of their lives.
Right.
Does that make sense?
No, it does make sense. It does make sense. I guess that if you have it's a bigger purpose though, then it gives you more drive and energy to go forwards as well in optimizing things around you.
It's a double-edged sword, actually. I've written a couple articles about purpose, and we talk about it in one of our classes. We talk about it in the book too, because it can give you more energy, and it can drive you faster into burnout because you're so driven by the mission that you can just plow through every indicator that you should have slowed down because you're so in service of this mission, and it feels bigger than yourself. It's not like you're actively choosing to be a martyr. But it's a little bit easier to hold distance when it doesn't resonate so deeply with your value system, right?
And from what you were saying for the last 15, 20 minutes, that makes an awful lot of sense now.
Yeah. And I'd be curious about the different approaches thing. I mean, something to think about is like, how does everyone else go through the process when they're trying to create change versus like, what are your steps, especially if some of the other ones, this isn't about inviting or inventing things that are net new, but it's like looking with a critical eye at the processes that might be in place and trying to understand if they are best serving the thing that you're trying to change.
Yeah, and maybe reflecting on how I do things anyway, which is something perhaps I don't do as much as I could or should. Which is something that struck me during the last slide or two. Yeah.
Anyone else? Marcus?
I'm curious how the Moonshot Pirates are doing with this concept of the catalysts. Unmute yourselves, Dorothy.
Actually, I also hung up at the first question, but now you explained it and I thought about it, and yeah, that's true. I'm trying to improve my lifestyle and read books about how to improve lifestyle, to listen to people, how to improve your lifestyle. And the last question as well, was it the last question? I think so. Yeah, so I'm like a 5 out of 7 catalyst.
Yeah.
I think I'm like.
Sorry, go ahead.
I think I'm like a little bit maybe the best friend of a catalyst. Like I'm maybe not the one who comes up with the ideas and has the drive, but the one who tries to support the catalyst in doing what he wants and creating the best out of it. I think it's what I could be, I think.
It's super helpful. We need those people. We need those people who recognize the value that we bring, because as you saw the list of sort of superpowers that we bring around VUCA, let's say, it's not things that organizations typically know how to, articulate value around. Increasingly, I think we know that we need them. These are the, I forget who was looking for the innovators within the organizations, but these are those people, right? But it's a tough road to hoe. And so people, there's kind of, you nailed a good one. We have supporters and we have translators who are great at helping catalysts. Translators are people, and maybe this might fit for the couple of you who are like, I'm like 5 out of the 7 questions. In my last role, the VP of operations that I hired to support me is probably a catalyst translator. He probably answers 5 out of the 7 questions affirmatively, and it's on a scale, but he can help me slow down and be a little bit more intentional and thoughtful about making that translation back to the rest of the company. Or my team, which is super helpful, because it's like, it helps me put the brakes on. Because the other thing I should have said is there's a range. So I am a hyper catalyst. My co-CEO and co-founder Tracy is an ethnographer and researcher by training, and she's a little bit more considered of a catalyst. So she will ask more questions. She'll be a little bit more judicious as we're, making decisions, which is great. It's a great balance. But we also have our COO, who's Emily, who's just really, she's a translator, but she's really she doesn't mind working at our speed, but she's not really a catalyst, and she's constantly making us ask the questions about, can you do all 10 things this week, ladies? Do you really think you can do that? So Marcus, you had raised your hand.
Yeah, well, I think I've transitioned from being the catalyst in the organization, like I was at Ernst & Young, and I was very, very young there and really senior. And then I just got so fed up with the bullshit around me. And I've ended up going to smaller and smaller organizations with bigger and bigger and bigger. So an organization I joined, well, I helped set up, there were 20 of us, and we had 10 billion sterling at our disposal, which is a lot of money actually for a small organization. And that was good. And, and then I built up a software company up to a couple of hundred, and it got bad, because, I built and I sort of realized that for me, organizational size, where are we now? We're about 10, is good, because it's not so big as you got all the bloody structures and shit which slows you down. And it's small enough that you don't have to have a huge revenue stream to keep you happy.
Yeah.
We don't have to feed the machine.
Yeah.
I'm guessing you're the same, because you're a small organization as well, aren't you?
We are, and it's very insightful. And the other thing that is sort of, implicit in what you're saying is catalysts often, and you start to be able to identify them almost from their LinkedIn profiles, because they will go to large organizations, they'll go to startups, they'll start their own thing. During the book launch, we had one of the catalysts sort of share his experience. And when he spoke, he said, people used to ask me, where I would be, what I was going to be doing, what's my 5-year plan? And he's like, I never knew how to answer that, because I've never had like a grand plan. And he's like, I was always in service of whatever the next problem was that I was trying to solve. And so he's like, now I have an answer for where I'm going to be in 5 years. He's like, I'm going to be a catalyst, but what I'm going to be catalyzing and how I'm going to be doing that, I can't tell you now. And so I think it's really insightful about, exactly what you're saying. It's like, this is where a little bit of the risk thing is true, is that a lot of catalysts are willing to make the jump because it becomes so intolerable to not make the change in their current environment, that actually trumps whatever risk they actually do fear. It's not like we don't fear it, but it's like the weight of not being able to make the change is so much stronger. And then, I work with catalysts we actually talk about financial security with catalysts, not financial advising. We're not doing that, but doing a little bit of the game plan, because, if you're young, guys, and you can set yourself up with intentionality and give yourselves the opportunity to make the bold statements when you're in the organizations and sort of fight for what's right, so that you can live your full self, but also be able to walk away if you need to. There's a woman on my board who worked at Genentech, and she was really one of the youngest people in their innovation group, and she was managing their startup program. And she was big and bold, and the other people didn't disagree with her, but they didn't feel like they had license to make the bold statements because they had mortgages and families and kids. And she's like, I can walk away and get another job, and it's no skin off my back. And so it's important to sort of set yourself up, particularly if you are a catalyst, because that crux moment probably will come someday, as Marcus can attest to. And so the more, spaciousness you can give yourself, the more opportunity you have to create the kind of change you want to see in the world.
Shannon, you said, what does that mean you are a hyper catalyst?
Well, so there's a scale, and it's about how fast and how big and how many things you do. So like, if you look at my LinkedIn profile, like, I'm an advisor right now. I'm on the Barbara Bush Foundation. I'm part of a global collective of people who are trying to create a regenerative world. And I'm starting my own company and co-CEO and delivering in that capacity full time. So for me, I'm always doing a million things. I am never satisfied. Like I'll tell you, because it's also in the personal life too. So I went to this mindfulness self-compassion retreat, which is really important for Catalyst. And I came back and I was speaking with my husband, and I was like, one of my biggest fears is that because I'm a Catalyst, I'm just going to keep moving and he basically won't be able to keep up. He's a Catalyst too, by the way. His last company was called Business Catalyst before we met. And he said, I'm okay going on the journey as long as we have some plateaus in between. Which was a totally fair response, right? But it's like, it's good for me to have someone who will ground me and say, let's just take some time. Let's just enjoy that we've done this big move to Colorado and we have this new house, and like put some of those projects on hold. So that's what it means. It's just about the intensity of like what I'm catalyzing and how many things I'm catalyzing. And I think there is a component, and it's not universal, about I'm an adrenaline junkie. So when you talk about that risk thing, I think that's one of the components that there's a big range for, and that can be dependent on life situation, as I was just saying. But it's also, I had this moment where I was driving through the desert with my son. He was like 10 years old. And we went around this curve. We're in the middle of nowhere, and this truck almost ran us off the road. So that huge adrenaline rush kicks in, right? And as soon as we realize that we're okay and whatever, I start laughing and he burst into tears, because that's the neurochemical response I have to fear and adrenaline. And not everyone has that, right? So that's the hypercatalyst. Hope that helps.
I have a similar syndrome, but I cannot call myself a catalyst, I think.
Yes, not all adrenaline junkies are catalysts. I'm not going to make that contention, but there is an overlap. I think there's a lot of sort of type A. If you look at the hobbies of a lot of catalysts, where, you know, I did rock climbing for a long time, mountain search and rescue. There's a lot of people who, I have a motorcycle, you know, there's a lot of that going on. Well, I just wanted to share, let me stop sharing and I'll get to the right slide so I don't make you seasick. So in addition to, come on Zoom, there we go. In addition to the book, which we obviously wrote, like the book for me is really the operating manual for Catalyst. It's kind of the book that I wish I had had 20 years ago. My motto is to not live life with regrets, or regret the things I have done, not the things I haven't done. But it would have been awesome to have had a book like this when I was earlier in my career, because Catalysts tend to think that they're the crazy ones. That's a pretty shared experience, because we are so often isolated, because we actually do function differently. And so that self-awareness of just like, it's not just me. And it's good to know that not everyone shows up like you too, because we can make assumptions about, well, of course everyone wants to continue learning. And of course people are going to lean into this or that, or of course people are comfortable with change. So that's why we wrote the book. And then we have sort of this, you know, compendium. You don't have to have read the book to do this, but it's basically an 8-week class applying all of the methodology and tools that we put in the book for Catalysts. So we have 2 courses starting in January. Each week you get 90-minute live sessions with us and a 60-minute optional group coaching. You get assigned a peer from around the world. So we have catalysts from around the world. And they're there to support you on the journey. And week by week, so we deep dive obviously much deeper into this about what it means to be a catalyst, starting with that self-awareness. And then we spend an entire week on vision, how to do it effectively, how to bring people along, a whole week on action and iteration. We spend an entire week on rejuvenation, because this is, like I said, not easy. We can think that rejuvenation feels like a nice to have, when really, if we want to make that vision a reality in the world, it's a necessity. We spend 2 weeks on orchestration, because as I mentioned, this is not necessarily like a natural skill set for us. And there's a lot to think about. How do you create, and we're talking about creating systems change, essentially. We talk about value and confidence, because by definition, we are often doing something net new. So your incentive structures, the way that people value you is probably not set up to acknowledge all of the work that you're doing. So we help you articulate that and create sort of your greatest hits list, so you can share that during interviews or with your boss. And then finally, it all coalesces so that you leave with an actual game plan, so you can figure out, you know, more concretely how to manifest that change in the world. If you're just interested in sort of a lighter engagement, we have a global network that's called the Galaxy, where we bring together catalysts from all of these fantastic companies. We have government people and public sector and education people, and even there's a lot of startups. We actually have a whole class dedicated to entrepreneurship for catalysts. I just got off of a speed networking call where we have people from all over the world getting to meet new catalysts, which is fantastic. And we have a lot of events. We bring in thought leaders. We have a writing for catalyst class tonight and a group coaching session every week where you can drop in and troubleshoot your current challenges with other catalysts. So you can go to galaxy.catalystconstellations.com for that. And with that, I'll just open it up to any final questions.